Hello again. I'm either losing my voice or just getting it back, but we're here to cover the progress on the engine for this week, so it doesn't really matter. So to start, I made the pistons and started the crank. To machine the pistons, I started with a piece of 1-inch aluminum round stock. I mounted it in the mill and surfaced what would be the crown of the piston. Then I drilled the wrist pin hole to 3/16 inch, and then used the 3/4 inch end mill to machine the skirt. I then brought this part over to the lathe to turn it down to its final outer diameter, only to overshoot it by about a 1/16 inch. I parted it off anyways and tried a different approach, because I felt there were better ways to go about this. I figured out what I was going to do after a little bit more experimenting. I first started by machining a flat across the top of the round stock, then I used 3 parallels to get the stock sitting flat in the mill, in addition to giving me a surface I could grab onto for later machining operations. I then machined the skirt with the 3/4 inch end mill, and then switched to the 3/16 inch drill bit to drill out the wrist pin hole. I then turned the piston down close to its final dimensions, and used the cutter to make a small indentation for the start of the ring groove. I then used a hacksaw to create the ring groove. I then brought the piston back to the mill after drilling into the center of the piston with a 3/16 inch bit, and creating the inside of the skirt with an 11/16 inch drill bit, both on the lathe. I put the 3/16 inch drill bit back into the mill, to center the mill on the center of the piston, and then switched to a 1/4 inch end mill to machine the pocket for the connecting rod into the piston. I then put the part back in the lathe and parted the piston off, and lightly sanded down the crown to get rid of the nub. I changed up a few things here and there to refine the operations for the rest of the pistons, and I was able to get the clearance between the piston and cylinders to be a very slight interference fit, with the pistons machining themselves to their final dimensions in the sleeves. The reflective areas on this piston are grooves cut into it from the steel sleeve, making a perfect fit. These pistons may not even need rings when it's all said and done. To start the crank, I set up an 8-inch long piece of 4130 alloy, yes, chromoly, vertically in the mill, and centered the mill on it with the dial indicator. These lobes were machined into the crank to allow me to flip it and get the offset holes in the same place on the other end of the crank, but I also had the intention of using them to allow me to later put it back into the mill to machine the counterweights. I ended up using them to also lock the crank to the chuck of the lathe. The offset holes are drilled to give me a place to put my dead center. I drilled the other set of offset holes in the opposite end of the crank after centering it again, and then started the upgrade process for my dead center I made a few years ago. I built a collar for my dead center to allow me to lock my crank to the chuck, so that I can apply more force with the parting tool. I started having major issues with chatter due to the intermittent cuts I had to make with the parting tool, so I mounted the crank back in the mill and used an end mill to take out a majority of the material for the rod journals. Once that was done, I mounted the crank back in the lathe to start the rod journals. While in the mill, I went a bit too far with the end mill and took too much material off the number 2 rod journal. I'm able to weld, so this wasn't an issue for me, so I added material back in and kept on machining. This journal didn't come out perfect, but I wasn't going to start again, and I was fine with it looking different from the rest. I then went after the main journals and then set the crank down for a little bit to give myself a break. Next week I'll be finishing the crank and simultaneously starting the crank bearings. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next video. Fireball out.